Well, I hope everyone loves big swords as much as I do, because today we're looking at two great swords of war. Hello, sword dude and dudettes. We are going to be looking at a tale of two great swords. Well, great swords of war, that is. So what is a great sword of war? These are hand-and-a-half swords from the early, or I should say middle, of the medieval period. So we're looking at starting in perhaps the 13th century. And these are swords that Ewart Oakeshott describes as the great swords, or the Espada de Guerre, great swords of war, which are distinct in that they accommodate enough room to put two hands on their hilts when most other swords of the time were single-handed swords. So this is the beginning of two-handed swords, although distinct from the true two-handers, as they're called. So this is in between a single-handed sword, a true two-handed sword, a hand-and-a-half sword, but it's not a long sword. Well, what is a long sword? Looks like I have a long sword here. When people are talking about long swords, they're usually referring to something like this. This is more what we're thinking about when we're thinking about the swords used by the fencing masters of the 15th through 16th century, the Italian and German fencing traditions. And you can see that this sword is a little bit smaller. Now, by the time of the 15th and 16th century, there's more variety of swords that are in use, and you find them both in a civilian context and a military context. So these big swords did not entirely go away. There's just more of them. So think about like when a telephone started, you just had one big blocky phone and that was it. And now we have flip phones, we have dial-up phones, we have smartphones. There's much more variety. The same thing is true. When hand-and-a-half swords started, they were big war swords. As time went on, you had civilian war swords. You eventually had war swords with complex hilts, or I should say, you had hand-and-a-half swords with complex hilts. You had some that remained very large and imposing, but you had others that were specialized for going through armor, and you had some that were fast and nimble. You had some that had shorter blades on them. You had a whole variety of hand-and-a-half swords. Some that had very long grips, some that had much shorter grips, some that were barely larger than an arming sword. So we're not talking about these later period hand-and-a-half swords. We're talking about the early period hand-and-a-half swords today. We'll bring this back out to compare later, perhaps. So, what are the two models that I have here in front of me? We have on the bottom from Windlass, the Royal Armouries Collection. This is the 14th century hand-and-a-half sword. And above it, we have from Albion, the Baron, which is a Type 12A, produced by Peter Johnson as an amalgamation of several different designs. So he studied a bunch of original antiques of this style of sword, and he designed this specially for Albion. Now, I've decided to compare these two, even though they're not exactly the same sword, but they are of the general same type. As of the time of this filming, you can buy from museum replicas the Windlass for around $600. The Albion is around $1,300. So once again, this is not an entirely fair comparison. They are of two pretty wildly different price points. You can buy almost two of the Windlass for one Albion. So this will be an opportunity for us to see what you get for almost twice the price. Is that worth it to you to spend that much more money? How much can you get for pinching your pennies a little bit? Can you get away with still a lot by looking at the Windlass? Just in general characteristics, you can see that both of these swords belong to very similar types. Again, they are over 1,600 grams. They have similar grip lengths. They have similar blade length, and these are both very broad-bladed, cutting-oriented swords that don't have specialized reinforced tips. I am going to say that they belong to Oakeshott Group 1, but there's going to be a reason to debate that as we go into the individual swords. If we start our journey by looking at the Windlass, the first thing we notice is that the Windlass comes with a scabbard. And I have to say, it's a pretty nice scabbard. A lot of swords, you will have to look for a scabbard from another maker. Albion especially is known for not coming with scabbards. This scabbard is wood cord and covered with form-fitted leather. The leather doesn't feel anything special, but it's not bad. It's so tight that it's not ever going to move. The stitching is done very neatly all the way up the back. And then it has a very well pressed in brass shape that has a little bit of decoration on it, but nothing too terribly fancy. It could be very slightly tighter tucked in. There's a little bit of space there, but this is well within the standards for the medieval period. So even though our modern aesthetic may say, oh, this should be done neater, from a historical perspective, that's perfectly fine. It has a single riser on there and nothing to adorn the shape. I can see the leather being tucked in very slightly around the throat, but everything on the whole seems very neat, and it's quite light. A lot of scabbards on reproductions are overbuilt. So on the whole, I'm very happy with this. I'm going to give it maybe an A- as far as historicity is concerned. I don't see anything big and glaring. Certainly for the kind of price point it's at, it's a rather nice example. It fits the blade very well. If I put it on, it fits the blade very well. It goes in and it has just enough give that it'll come on. There's no chance that it will come off automatically. The sword is so heavy that if I turn it around, it'll just kind of ease itself out. But that's in part because we have a lot of hilt that's going on here. While I'm holding it in the scabbard, I'll talk about the hilt briefly. So it has very well-formed grip with 4 risers along it. The cord-wrapped leather is all very neatly done with a very tight seam. However, as a bugaboo, when I opened this up, I noticed that as soon as I touched it, the leather on here is incredibly hard. I'm not sure what type of finishing treatment has been done to this leather, but has left it with an almost plastic-like consistency. Very hard, durable plastic. I equated it to something like a bed liner, to the point that if I just rub my finger along this, because of the corrugation here, it'll actually start to risk chafing my poor little pitties. This is very, very durable, and it probably is not going to get damaged particularly easily, but this is not a particularly pleasant sensation if you're just wielding it barehanded. So it looks beautiful, but this is one of the more uncomfortable grips I've actually held. The pommel is huge. If I compare it to the Albion pommel, you can see that this particular shape of pommel, which is characteristic, you see these a lot, for example, on Eastern European swords of the period, is very large. It might take a little getting used to for some. I personally don't mind it, but it is very well shaped. It has a kind of burnished finish on it. I don't see any errant marks or casting flaws or the like, and it feels quite nice to the touch. It has a very obvious peen on there. It's not the sloppiest peen I've ever seen, but it's not the tidiest either. It's got, I'll give it a middle score as far as the peen job that's done there. However, the guard, which is a kind of unique guard, I really like the example from this Royal Armouries sword. The end of the quillons kind of curve backwards towards the grip rather than being angled forward, as you might expect a guard of this type to be. Has very, very crisp lines. In fact, they're crisp enough that it almost risks catching my fingers. So this has, rather than a handmade sort of feel to it, it has a machine sort of feel to the guard. And in fact, there was one little point along it that had a catch and a raised burr on it that was risking cutting myself when handling it. I noted it on my unboxing, and I had to file it down immediately so I didn't risk cutting myself on the gar. It's very small. It's maybe 0.5 millimeter that I had to sand off. It looks like another blade perhaps caught it and just cut a little gouge out of the guard in that one spot. The blade itself is a type that is up for debate. This is a blade that Ewart Oakeshott describes in two different sources as different types. This is either a type 16A blade or a type 12A blade, depending on which version, which description you want to follow. The museum currently describes this as a type 16A blade, which would typically have a hexagonal section that then transitions perhaps into a diamond cross section further up here, usually ending in a more acute point rather than a rounded point. This particular blade is basically a hexagonal blade the entire length down and has a rather broad tip, more like the Group 2 swords. So this belongs to a type that is probably what I would say is a tweener, so an in-between type. It has elements that you can see in both Group 1 and Group 2 swords, so maybe it's partly type 16A and partly type 12A sword. It has stamps that are consistent with the origins of the sword that was part of the Mamluk arsenal of Alexandria. So you'll see an Arabic inscription here and an arsenal stamp on this side. And it does have a laser cut stamp showing both the Royal Armouries as well as the Windlass stamp on the ricasso. So it's got a bit of a noisy bit of inscription going on here. The way that they've reproduced the original marks are very neat and tidy. The Royal Armouries mark and the Windlass mark are rather large. I can see how some people might not like that, but at least it looks consistent with the rest of the other marks, and it's in the place where a maker's mark would usually go. The lines on it show signs that it is a handmade blade. It is not terribly wobbly. We have a little bit of wavers in the fullering. The lines of the edge show a bit of wavering as well, but on the whole, they're not that bad. I would give it, a B plus or an A minus as far as how even the lines are. Now, this is the big thing. Take a look at my hand along the blade. These blades from the Royal Armouries Windlass partnership come without a final edge put on them. Now, the geometry on this is quite good, and we will show its performance in a minute. It is still possible to get to cut light targets with this out of the box, as I will demonstrate. However, it comes down to a point, a final edge that's blunt of maybe 3/4 of a millimeter. It does not have a final edge on it. That was a decision made by the Royal Armouries. They did not want a final edge on it. The geometry is quite good, and because the geometry is quite good, and because of the type of sword that this is, because this is a broad cleaving sword with a lot of leverage on it, you can still cut with it out of the box if you know what you're doing, if you have good technique, good alignment, and you're practicing good swordsmanship. But if you actually want to get serious with it, you're going to need to put a final edge on it. Obviously, that's a bit of an ask given how long a sword this is, which means that's an additional charge, or you're going to have to be very good with your technique. So think about that when you're purchasing it. Are you going to have someone like Cult of Athena do it, or are you going to have to ship it to another person to do the finishing in order to put the edge on this blade? Some people always are going to put additional, post-market edges on their blade because they want them ready for competition cutting, so it doesn't matter. But that's a consideration for this particular sword. It does have a reasonably fine point on it, so it should thrust no problem. But that's less of a concern for folks than the ability to cut with the sword. So keep in mind that this sword is not sharp and ready to go right at the gate. By comparison, we have from Albion. What is all that extra cash getting you? You have a very tidily executed sword. So even though we have things that will superficially look very similar to the sword that I was holding, there is evidence of higher craftsmanship, that you're paying for that additional premium. Obviously, it does not come with a scabbard. So if having a scabbard is important to you, you're going to have to send this sword off to someone who is going to be able to produce a aftermarket scabbard for the sword. The pommel is wide and has dimension in it in both directions. And again, this is Peter Johnson's design, so it's not based off of a single sword. The peen block on it is lovely, and there's no evidence of the peen mark either indicating where the tang terminates in the peen block, or any hammer marks related to striking the peen. All of the finishing, the hand finishing on the elements are beautiful and feel great to the touch, so that if you're running up against it, there's not going to be any type of discomfort. The grip on it, even though it doesn't have any risers, has a lot of dimension, both in this plane as well as in this plane. So it has a swell to it in both dimensions, which gives it a very ergonomic feeling in both hands. The leather also is very supple and nice and quite durable. I've been using this pretty extensively recently, and there's no indication that it's received any damage just from using it with my bare hands. The cross has an octagonal cross section that has a lot of beautiful transitions going between the rise in the middle and coming and curving towards the ends of each of the quillons. And once again, there's basically no flaws in how it's done. I didn't mention the gap in the guard. There's a very slightly larger gap in the guard on the windlass example, but I personally am not one that is too fastidious about how tightly the guard is fitted to the blade shoulders, unless it's a particularly egregious example where it's obvious that the blade had nothing to do with the guard that was put on it. Because on original antiques, you find a wide variety in gaps, some of which are tightly fitted, some of which are really widely done. The fullering on here is a lot more even. The edges are razor sharp going all the way down, or I should say they're razor straight going all the way down, with the fuller going consistently down the blade and just very gently petering off as we end into the lenticular section of the Type 12A, and with the fuller basically terminating in the same spot on each side of the blade. And the single maker's mark, Albion's stamped very tastefully only on one side of the blade, and the other side being entirely bare. This particular Albion is not the sharpest example. There are other Albions that are decidedly sharper out the box, and there are some that are even more sharp than this particular one. It has a decent amount of flex in the area of the blade that you want, but it's not as floppy as you might expect for a sword of this relative thinness out in the end. And as you'd expect from a sword designed from Peter Johnson, it exhibits complex distal taper with good thickness in the ricasso area, with accelerated thinning, especially as we get out into the foible, allowing it to handle dynamically. Now, we're not going to spend as much time cutting with these swords as we usually do, in part because the windlass doesn't have an edge on it. In the future, I probably will put an edge on it and we'll revisit it. And also in part because I'm not formally trained in longsword fencing. And as I mentioned before, these aren't swords that were used in longswording per se, although you can pick one up. If you're a longsworder, you can certainly pick one up and use it for longswording techniques. Now, it's not going to be as much fun as if you have a proper longsword. And to demonstrate that, let's just do a quick drill. So, for instance, if I and we want to try and do the same with a great sword. The windlass. Trying to cut my camera off. And the Baron. So the Baron is decidedly the most authoritative of the swords. It has a lot of inertia into it. And while you can certainly use it for your longsword fencing, it requires a bit more energy and commitment to doing the techniques. And it really just wants to continue to go. So if you try and use this for your longsword drills, you're going to get quite a workout in doing it. Windlass versus the green bamboo. Even with no edge, obviously no problem. You can see it still made a pretty clean cut. Baron doing the same. No problem whatsoever. Against my dense archery foam, the windlass went in, even with no edge, about 10 centimeters. And it thrust pretty well, not all the way through, but again, it's not a very durable target in that direction. Well, I think we can see that the Baron won that particular contest. You can see the Baron has tremendous cleaving power. I'll give it a run through. I'll let that speak for itself. And if we give the windlass a good go, take two, giving the windlass a good go. You can see that it clove through some of the bottle and then it kind of tore or exploded the rest. So, in summary, these are two really cool, very large swords. This is from a period of history where these swords were expected to be used on the battlefield against heavily armored foes, and in a time when you weren't necessarily trying to stick the sword in between the gaps and you still encountered opponents where you had a lot of armor, but maybe you could still deliver powerful sweeping attacks against the other opponent. Maybe they had a mixture of armor going on. It's really neat. Both of them, they handle very fun. They handle very entertainingly. They're just a pleasure to handle in the hand, despite their great size, and they are both tremendous cutters. The windlass has the advantage of having the scabbard, but the fact that it really needs that additional sharpening really hampers its ability if you're just buying it stock. And the type of grip that it has on it definitely could use some improvement. Anyone who is planning to pick one up, if you're planning to send it off to someone to sharpen it, sending it to have the grip redone would also be probably high on the list of ways to improve the sword. Otherwise, the sword is a really handsome example of the collection. Paying more to get higher quality, Albion quality really does shine, and the performance of the Baron cannot be denied. Even if it's not competition cutting sharp yet, just the overall power, mass distribution, and the current edge is enough for it to be a very formidable cutter right out the gates. And it's a lot of fun to have in general. So thank you very much, Duzzies, who's had this to me for an extended period of time, for lending me the Baron for review. I hope everyone enjoyed this, and we'll be back next time for even more sword discussion. Take care, guys.